the centrality of so-called adult education methodologies. In my own experience, many religious educators place great stock in what they call andragogy, trusting the knowledge students have already attained. This approach has its rightful place. But the andragogues move, I'm quoting kind of one of the scholars in this area, the andragogues move from dependency towards increasing self-directedness, end quote, may overshadow the resources of finitude. The example of Muhammad suggests that ways students are bereft may be more theologically significant than ways students are competent. A curriculum that acknowledges human limitation will be a curriculum that pedagogically acknowledges the sheer giftedness of human knowledge. Fostering awareness of finitude goes hand in hand with fostering the feeling of absolute dependence. And I had to throw the feeling of absolute dependence in to get Schleiermacher back on my side. A preference for the unlettered student is a question of resources. Resources are always finite. Muhammad had to face this question himself when his daughter came to him, requesting that a servant be given to help her. She was overextended, suffering from blistered hands and a strained chest. And there was nothing in that culture intrinsically wrong with her request for a servant to help. However, given the limitations of resources at hand, Muhammad had to discern how to best use those resources. A preferential option for the student required frugality. So he averred, saying, the food of one is enough for two. The food of two, enough for four. The food of four, enough for 8. Reorienting curricula and pedagogy in the direction of finitude requires making tough choices. The preferential option is just that. It's an option, a choice. What policy changes would result if educators took the preferential option for the unlettered student? What if educators not only asked Herbert Spencer's classic question, what knowledge is of most worth, but asked what students are most worth teaching? Perhaps students most worth teaching are those who are unlettered, orphaned, and fully aware of their vulnerability. Perhaps their experience of scarcity can help us rethink what sort of resources we need to teach in a religious environment. Perhaps the experience of finitude can reorient educational practice to a poorer curricula, where the food of one is enough for two, the food of two enough for four, and the food of four enough for 8. Thank you very much.
So during this time, we're going to move to question and answer. So feel free, ask whatever you would like.
I might sit down as we do that.
You're more than welcome to.
I have a very basic question. Of all the people you could have moved from Dewey to your other work, tell me how you moved toward this particular interest in putting in pedagogy together.
I guess I'm still interested in Dewey, and as I said, I'm interested in new dialogue partners for how we do education. I think interreligious education is going to be more and more vital moving to the future. We often talk about interreligious dialogue, and that's important, but I think interreligious education is a little different than dialogue. And so, yeah, that's where some of the interest came. And also, in a very practical way, as a teacher, be teaching like a class, an intro to world religions, type class, wanting to engage in those questions from an authentic place, and not to have the answers, not to see the religious other as the stranger, but to see myself as the stranger who could learn from. Yeah.
The students who are most deserving, was that the phrase that you used?
I don't know if I used that phrase. I asked the question, what students are most worth teaching?
Worth teaching, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Do you think that a student's sense of entitlement can get in the way of them being, most worth teaching? That sort of keeps them from seeing their financial?
Yeah, so with that, I was kind of riffing on this classic curriculum question that Herbert Spencer asked, what knowledge is most worth having?
Sure.
I think the answer is yes. As a theologian, I see it as a matter of realizing that knowledge is a gift and that privilege comes from a particular place, and it's not just an accident of history, but there are particular cultural forces that shaped it, and that those can become blinders. As a theologian, they can become religious blinders.
And would it be possible to help a student, would that be worth it, and would it be possible to help a student who is very entitled to understand to leave that behind, to understand their finance, to leave it behind, to be able to grow into a place where they were less entitled?
Yeah, I think so. How we do that as teachers, that would be a great conversation to have.
Okay, yeah, that would be.
What are your thoughts on
that?
What are your thoughts on it?
I'm not a teacher, by the way, but I run into this from time to time.
Yeah.
In the current young generation, and it bothers me a little bit, but more than anything, I would like to have a way to help these kinds of children understand, be more thankful, be less, taking advantage.
Yeah, great point.
Maybe I can ask how you link this up with other parts of the Islamic tradition. I'm not sure how common this one is. I mean, the most common metaphor I see of a student and teacher is that, it might even be from Farida Dinatar, but certainly from a lot of similar writings, that the student's relationship to a teacher is a corpse to a body washer. That the student has nothing, and it's the teacher who is, completely the master in that relationship. Do you just set that part of it aside, or other? I guess trying to figure out what to do with a lot of other metaphors of the student-teacher relationship in Islam, and that's a pretty common one. Of the corpse and the body washer.
I've never heard that one before, and so I'm not exactly sure what you're saying. I think there is a strong sense of human agency within Islam. People have the freedom to respond, and Islam was revealed in a culture described as the culture of ignorance. Jahiliyyah, a culture of darkness and paganism and this sort of thing. And
maybe it's the dependence of the student on the teacher.
Yeah. Contemporary, Muslims say this culture of ignorance was not just a historical condition, but it's a moral condition that continues, and the obligation to command good and to forbid evil, the obligation to struggle in the way of God are perpetual obligations. So I don't sense a kind of an exclusive passivity. I think sometimes because our theology of Scripture is different than a Christian theology of Scripture is different than a Muslim theology of Scripture. We don't understand the importance of memorization, which does happen by rote, and it is what it is, and so that may be some reason for that. But I haven't heard the metaphor you mentioned. I'd love to find out more about it.
Let me hop onto that one just a little bit. I'm going to see if I can formulate this question very well. Here's what I'm thinking about. And I think it feels like it connects to Bill's question a little bit, Aaron. You talked about Muhammad in the tradition being unlettered, that's kind of important because it means, at least in a lot of popular arguments, that he brought nothing to the table when it comes to basically the production of the Quran. So he himself is a passive, if I can use that language, recipient of revelation. Is that an okay way to put it? I mean, just drawing on what you even said, like, so that there were no written influences. And I mean, I guess I suppose, not being a Muslim myself, I suspect an awful lot of influences that perhaps weren't written. They were oral, they were cultural. And, the point being that those are in a sense denied, which would be the social reality of his own formation is being, in a sense, rejected in the name of a vertically, sort of bestowed revelation that seems to me, in some ways, works against the notion of dependence upon another human being in my finitude, as a student to learn. It's instead, there's almost a model of independence from, a human agent. I know, and I'm not saying that very well, but you probably follow kind of.
No, I do follow.
And so it's not like, I'm just kind of wondering what you think about that or how that fits in.
I think you understood correctly, and I think it's something I want to think through, but we'd have to add to that the Sunnah as a source of revelation as well. So it's not just that vertical, but it's the practice of Islam as he faced new questions and deliberations, and that's massive.
That's what I still need to learn about that.
The Sunnah being the practices and teachings of Muhammad himself, not the words of God, which are the Quran.
I'm wondering though if that I guess what I'm getting is if that model might translate into a very authoritarian notion of the teacher, in a sense, being like the God figure to a passive recipient student.
Right, and I
guess, I don't know. I'm just wondering about that model.
Helpful. And I was trying to say is, Muhammad was the prophet.
Right.
So he had a privileged place. But he was a prophet who was not the incarnated Son of God, but was an orphan, was a person who was left to the side, rejected. And so his example was, his prophethood was based on that vulnerability. So Revelation assumes that. Now maybe I'm, as a Christian, reading kind of incarnation and that kind of stuff into it. I wouldn't want to do that, but maybe those filters are just hardwired.
Sure.
So it's helpful. Thanks, Bill. Yes, thanks.
So you talked about the possibility of developing a liberation pedagogy. Could you talk a little more about what you think that would be? And to what degree is that just sort of duplicating Freire, or is it moving in a slightly different direction?
Yeah, so in his book Quest for Meaning, Tariq Ramadan has this really kind of provocative phrase: we need the educational equivalent of liberation theology. He doesn't really pursue it that much. As a writer, he likes to just throw these poetic little...
Who's the we? Does he mean Muslims,
yeah,
or does he mean...
that's a great question as well. I think that book is cast wider. We, humanity. we people who are engaged in a quest for meaning. Of course, Islam assumes itself to be a revelation for all humanity, so those two could be one and the same. But so yeah, he doesn't pursue it as well. I think Paulo Freire, really resounds well with liberation theology. There's a lot of value there. What I was trying to do with that is use it as a metaphor. He says we need the educational equivalent of, and I wasn't trying to propose anything about liberation theology per se, only to use it analogically.
But I'm interested in the application to education more than I am in liberation theology. And what I want to know is what do you think it's going to look like in education?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I tried to unpack some of that. The preference for the student, a poorer curriculum.
When you say, could you talk about what that means?
Yeah.
What do you mean by a poorer curriculum? I mean, I'm pretty sure I know what you don't mean. So, you're not saying like, well, let's just teach them crap. But so, what are you thinking with that?
The question of resources is a big question. The question of privilege is a big question. I think the question of access. The ways we do education are political statements that say particular people have access and particular people don't. I think, this is just a buzzword, but grassroots type education can happen. We were talking about the pastoral leadership before. In a religious context, this can happen, maybe not at a higher education level, but through adult education programs and congregational levels, this sort of thing. I feel like that's a whole other topic, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. What interests you about the question, and it might help me to think a bit more through that.
Okay, I run and teach in a program that we have designed for a small number, about 25 freshmen, who do not qualify to get in.
Yeah.
Most of them are first generation to college. Many of them are students from minority or underserved populations.
Yeah.
And I have been doing this work probably for about 16 weeks. And I write a lot about what it means, and not just those students, I mean those students in particular, but other students too, where I hear colleagues, well, they should have learned that skill by now, so.
Yeah.
And, and it begins to feel like, are we in the business of teaching the pre-educated? If that's all we're doing, are we really teaching at all? Or do you teach the student where the student is at? I mean, I could be off and running for a long time. That gives you an idea of sort of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, that gives me a much better idea. Is that here at Point Loma?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And do you see that work is? Do you see the phrase educational equivalent of liberation theology? You find that helpful? Does it resonate? Is it affirming?
Well, I'm a big fan of Freire.
Yeah.
And so the writing I've done on this topic has very much circled around his work and the ways in which it can be practically applied, not only in that kind of a program, but in any class. So yeah, I resonate with all of that sort of concern for educating the student where the student is at, and not only wanting, as somebody said, if you've got smart little piggies coming in the front door, it's no surprise if you have prime grade A bacon coming out. But what about improving all the students and in fact casting a wider net?
Yeah.
So yeah, and our programs like this around the country have about a 36 to 37% graduation rate. We're running in the 70s. So it's been good fun.
There's two thoughts that's fascinating. Two thoughts come to mind from the paper, the first one, and that is the person at the very top, the prophet, was invested in the sufa. It was his work. And so having the institutional buy-in, I think, is important, symbolically. You mentioned the word skills. It took my mind straight to, so the theological college I'm part of is connected with the Uniting Church in Australia, which is Congregationalist, Presbyterian, and Methodist, like the United Church of Canada. Faculty and heads of theological colleges had a meeting all across the country with members of multicultural parts of the church. We've got a lot of Pacific Islanders, we've got indigenous communities, we've got a number of immigrants to Australia. And we were there to listen to them, and it was their request that we come listen to them. And the common refrain was, we have experienced God deeply. We know Jesus Christ intimately. We come into your theological colleges, and we are treated, like none of that counts. And it centered around the question of assessment. How do you assess religious, theological knowledge? And for them, storytelling and an oral culture was a big part of it. And whereas we were wanting essays and footnotes, and whereas plagiarizing, we had one definition of what constituted plagiarizing. For them, and not to paint them all with a broad stroke, but that had a very different meaning. The use of someone else's material had kind of different ethical implications. So that's a very different context than you're working in, but that is the question of assessment. How do you deal with that?
Well, it comes, there's two kinds of assessment to begin with. There's formative and summative. And I tend to move the bulk of what I do into formative assessment and have worked on what I call forensic grading. Where you are grading not just, did they meet this bar? I mean, you can also grade for improvement, but grading, looking at student work for clues as to how a student thinks about a task, how they approach a task, what actually they're assuming about a task, because sometimes it's those unwritten assumptions about how they ought to proceed that in fact are just getting in the way. And if you can figure out what those are, you have the chance to really impact a student greatly. So, we've been able to, it looks like you have, and then, it takes time, but it looks like you have an anxiety disorder, or it looks like you have an auditory processing issue, or it looks like you judge yourself so harshly that you can't even get a sentence written before you haven't condemned it yourself. And as we come alongside where the problem is, we can really make huge progress for the students. So assessment becomes, in a large part of what I do, a diagnostic tool.
There's almost a therapy going on, it sounds like.
I think most people, if they look at their own educational experiences, would admit that education is riddled with emotion. You experience fear, you experience anxiety, you experience uncertainty, you experience, faced with new ideas, faced with threatened. There's a lot of emotion that comes into it. And sometimes a student needs a word of encouragement, a vision of hope about the seeds of possibility within them.
Well, thanks for that.
So I have a question for both of you. Who then do you consider, pardon my language, the poor student and the rich student? Is the poor student, a student who comes from a theological background, like a pastor's child or a missionary's child, are they more on the rich side because we're dealing with a theological school in this case, or a Christian-oriented school in our case? Or could they be the poor student because they come from a poorer background? They may have been in a third world country or whatever if they're a missionary child. Or is it just
in terms of teaching theology, I've found in personal experience as well that having been raised in church and knowing everything, that sort of thing, it's often been not helpful. Because you tend to look past problematic texts, and you've got the kind of you've got the escape, you've got the solutions worked out to the difficult questions. So you don't have those fresh eyes.
I like to use the phrase, everybody is Swiss cheese.
Everybody is what?
Swiss cheese.
Oh, really?
A lot of substance and a bunch of holes.
And isn't it education that shows us our holes?
That's right, but also the teacher can perceive, this is where the substance is, this is what I can build on. As in your example of the Pacific Islanders who came with traditions that could in fact be used to help their learning.
That's been really helpful. Some more practical.
Aaron, excuse me, to another course here for a moment. Is Islam prolific with this DNA that you're talking about? I mean, has it become endemic in Islam? And today, are they still practicing that?
What do you mean by this DNA?
Well, I mean, is it a part of the culture?
You mean this pedagogical?
Yeah, of course.
These
That's the
ideas.
subject we're here for.
Yeah, just like.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. It's really hard to. It's wrong to paint Islam with a really broad brush. I think the moderates are the classic case of the very large majority, and the loud minority are what we see as often as Islam in the West. But within the kind of moderate Islam, I think there is and I quoted Tariq Ramadan, there's a very rich sense of scholarship and engagement with the text and asking critical questions like, are the chain of narrations as reliable from which we get the hadith? Are they as reliable as tradition has said? Was Muhammad really illiterate in the way the tradition has said? So those are kind of philosophical issues, but for me they go to the question of human agency. There's a concept in Islam of ijtihad, which is struggle and exertion towards a problem that is not addressed by the sources of revelation conclusively. And so there's ways of rethinking it. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
I'm asking, do they look for the orphan as a compassionate arm of who they are? Is that a character trait?
Yeah, okay. I did some very different research. In 2011, some major floods hit Brisbane. And a few months later, we actually got a grant, and we went back and looked at what were religious responses to the floods. How did different religious communities respond to it? Was it an act of God, that sort of thing? We talked with the Muslims, and they were very involved in sending hampers and care packages and that sort of thing.